Statistics in the College of Public Health at the University of Georgia. But to me the most important thing of José Cordero is that he has been used for public health services during 27 years, working at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. He was the founding director of the National Center for Vertebrates and Developmental Disabilities, and I think this is a person very well involved in the work prevention, applied congenital malformation of other immunization and other kind of activities. He's from Puerto Rico, but he speaks Spanish. Sorry.
Buenas tardes. Me han pedido que hable en inglés, así que creo que va a ser Spanglish. Thank you. I have to go and get my... First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, or ICOR, and also the local host here in East Day in Mexico for the invitation to be with you today. I'd like to follow rules, and I was told that I needed to say that I have no conflict of interest, so I'm complying with that rule. As I was listening to the presentations this morning, especially the history of the organization and the challenge, and so a part of that was our center worked very closely with NORD in the development of the orphan drugs legislation, and realize how important it is when we're dealing with something that is so rare, that it's important that we all together work throughout the world to be sure that we get the best knowledge and in the fastest way possible. We have something, a challenge like that nearly 30 years when I started in the area of genetics, and even before, when we think about before the 20th century, when you see writings about birth defects, these were curiosities. There was something that nothing could be done, and in many cultures of Mesoamerica, actually, for example, having a cleft in the palate was a very negative sign. But in the 20th century, especially after the 1950s and forward, there was a great deal of advance in technology, both in terms of developing genetics from cytogenetics to biochemical genetics to molecular genetics and prenatal diagnosis. It is also, I think, that one of the first times that we deal with diseases that actually would fall into a rare category, like it was at the time a PKU, and using newborn screening, it was possible to actually do something that actually helps these children have a very optimal development. And also during that a period that birth defects begin to be recognized as a public health issue. And part of that came on one side from thalidomide and the epidemic of babies with missing limbs and other serious birth defects, mainly in Europe, some in Australia, but also then the major epidemic of rubella leading to congenital rubella syndrome and the pretty serious syndrome of cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and hearing deficit. But also at the tail end of the 20th century, we began to recognize that birth defects can be prevented, that there is primary prevention for birth defects, and that's the story of folic acid. And I will be talking a little bit more specific about that. Also, it is in that tail end of the 20th century when sequencing of the human genome is completed for the first time. And to see how much we have advanced on in just a few years that we have in 1 decade and a half in the 21st century. Yesterday I was at a meeting in Georgia with a group that's working in the genomics of cancer. And what they were reporting is that with a new technology, they can do the entire sequence of a tumor cell in 2 hours. This is when it took years just to do the first sequencing of the human genome. Also, not only can be done quickly, but the cost that were in the billions for the very first sequence now are in 500, 1,000, estimated that in a few years it may go down to about $100. So that is advances in technology that I think also are going to be very, very important. And part of that advance in technology sequencing comes with the great advances in just general technology that have started with the genomics, means looking and understanding how the genes actually function, to then move into proteins and how they function, the metabolites and how they function, and perhaps more important now is how, instead of just looking at a single exposure, you can look at the profile of all exposures that a person may have, and those also offer great possibilities, both in terms of birth defects, but also I think in terms of understanding how what is the pathogenesis, both genetic and environmental interactions in some of the rare diseases. In terms of prevention, I'm going to sort of focus mainly on primary prevention and folic acid. But another example is rubella vaccine that actually has eliminated in many countries a very serious disease. But also there is a great deal that has been done in secondary prevention, and early detection is one, and that's, for example, autism is one example. Also, newborn screening falls in that category in the aspect of preventing, say, mental retardation. It falls in the tertiary prevention because it's more about you're not doing anything to change the disease in a way. You're trying to deal with the complications that come with it. And the same can be said about surgery, like for birth defects and congenital heart defects. This has become a very, congenital heart defect surgery, it's become such a common practice these days that in places like in Atlanta at Emory, repair and of adults that had surgery as a child with congenital heart disease, it's now more common than doing coronary bypass. So I would like to sort of focus on prevention of neural tube defects as a primary prevention, and because I think it gives a story of what can be done or has been done in terms of one or group of birth defects, and then how can something like that be applied elsewhere. Just to remind you, neural tube defects are very serious birth defects, and that include anencephaly, which is when the cranium doesn't close. Also includes spina bifida, in this case the terminal meningomyocele, but also includes encephalocele, which is another variant in terms of the neural tube defects. For years, it was known that there were epidemics of neural tube defects, and this is one in the U.S. Around the 1930s that Brian McMahon and Irene Chen looked, and as you see, it had, I'd like you to sort of look at this number here. It's nearly 5 per 1,000 babies born with birth anencephaly and spina bifida in 2 hospitals in Boston and Rhode Island. So that said, it can't be just genetic. There has to be a genetic component. And it was Richard Mills that actually in the UK that came up with the answer, and that it could be a micronutrient and a specific folic acid. But and there are multiple studies that were done in terms of epidemiologic studies, including one that we did at CDC. But it was really Nick Walt that doing a well-designed clinical trial showed that folic acid did prevent neural tube defects. And in the group that did not receive folic acid, and these were women that already had a child with a neural tube defect, 3.5% of them had the child was a neurological defect, whereas the group that it was treated was, in this case, 4 milligrams of folic acid was only 1%. This was a clinical trial that was planned to go for about 5 years. And in 2 years, they had these results, and actually that led to stopping the trial. It also led to stopping the trial that we were planning in China, and then became a demonstration project where we did show that 400 micrograms given to pregnant women at least a month before pregnancy begins can reduce the rate of neurological defects by nearly 70%. This led to the recommendations, and this is actually published by CDC in the US, and it was any woman capable of becoming pregnant should consume 4 micrograms of folic acid daily to reduce the risk of neurological defects. And the basis of that is that when you have nearly 50% of pregnancies are unintended or missed time, it is important to consume it all the time. But also it pointed out that in families or women that had a history of a previous child with a neurological defect or a sibling, it should be 4 milligrams, especially in the preconceptional time. Based on those findings, CDC recommended and one better just consuming products that have more folic acid. We also talked about fortification or consuming a vitamin daily that would have contain folic acid. I can tell you that we did a lot of effort both in terms of education and especially for consuming either vitamins or more, and that did not work. And that was the reason that actually we pushed for the use of fortification, and actually that was something that started in about 1998. It is something that has been highly successful, and I'll show you some data on that. Here we go. I pointed those out. But now worldwide we have a large number of countries, many in the Americas, and also Africa and Asia, and that are doing fortification. Some of the methods are simply to include it in all the flour, but especially in Africa, it is working with small meals that may do just by a couple of bags a day, and that also has been successful. How have that impacted neurological defects? And again, let's just look at what happens in terms of the US, and my laser seemed to have gone, oh, I got it. These were the levels, and these are women that are of Hispanic age or Hispanic ethnicity, and then on the middle is whites, and these are African Americans. And as you see, there's a big discrepancy in terms of the much higher in Hispanic, and actually it had gone down, and but still there is a disparity in this group. Part of this, and one part is actually during the same period in the U.S., the consumption of corn masa and tortillas and salsa has increased to the point that in the U.S. there's more consumption of tortillas and salsa than ketchup and potato chips. Yeah. But why are we having this difference? And we have been studying that, and the answer is two. One is, yes, we need to have corn masa fortified, and we're working with FDA and the Food and Drug Administration to do that. But also, there's some genomic differences and that are important. And it's the folic acid pathway is a fairly complex and a type of system, and there are many opportunities for different kind of mutations, and many have been identified. But there is one in specific that is the methylene tetrahydrofolic reductase alleles that actually genotype TT that leads to high levels of homocysteine, that itself increases the risk for certain kind of cardiovascular disease. But also that group tends to increase the risk of neural tube defects. And the distribution of these genetic defects is very rare in Canada, but in the publications is both very high in northern China and in some parts in Mexico. And those are groups that probably need, rather than just 0.4, more vitamins, more levels of folic acid. So here you have an example of an intervention that actually is an effective public health strategy, and it has been implemented. And in the U.S. alone, it has reduced every year. We have close to 1,500 fewer babies born with neural tube defects. Those are babies that are born healthy, that otherwise would have had anencephaly or spina bifida. But also the second lesson here is that we can't just stop there. We need to look at the genomics, and we need to look at other potential environmental factors. Another thing that is coming up that has been discussed is the role of aflatoxins. And again, a combination of an environmental and genetic factor. So how does that bring us to the opportunities in terms of prevention in the future? One of the common threats, both if we're talking about the two primary prevention strategies that I pointed out, the rubella vaccine or folic acid, but the common link is that these are interventions that need to start before pregnancy begins. And at CDC, we had actually put together a large panel looking at what can we do that in terms of interventions that are done pre-conception. And the answer is there's a lot that can be done. And actually, the number of interventions that now are 30 or 40 continue to increase every year. And these recommendations were published by the CDC some years back, about 2006, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Physicians, and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists have all endorsed them. And so I just list some of here because are some of the things that are the obvious suspects, like stop smoking, stop drinking, addressing maternal conditions like diabetes, especially getting good control of diabetes. That actually is important because diabetic mothers that are diabetic, whether they're gestational, whether they are type A or type 1 or type 2, they will actually have a high risk if they're under poor control. Addressing family history, sometimes just being able to find out a high risk of, say, Down syndrome may be important aside from the age. So that is something that, and that's where we were, say, in 2006. But in the process, we also have been monitoring, meaning CDC, the kinds of exposures that occur in the population, especially for chemicals that could really have are significant hazards. There are millions of chemicals that are circulating, and of those, there's a list of about 150, 200 that are of concern. And through a survey called the National Health Interview Nutrition Survey, blood and urine are obtained in healthy volunteers, adults, and that has led to this report that basically give us what are the levels distribution in typical individuals, but also it's giving us opportunity to look at when we repeat the testing, saying or do testing in the population, in the clinical population, what patients have levels that are too high. For example, we're doing a study in Puerto Rico looking at phthalates, which are plastic softeners, and are very they're used in everything from lipstick to the plastic that wraps candy to everything. And our women in Puerto Rico, there's close to a third that have levels that are well over 95th percentile of the distribution in the US. So basically they have high levels. So we could use this to actually look at what are the exposures before pregnancy,